Hello and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Chapter 22. How completely unthinkable, Jesserac mused, this conference would have seemed only a few short days ago. The 6 visitors from Lys sat facing the council along a table placed across the open end of the horseshoe. It was ironic to remember that not long ago Alvin had stood at that same spot and heard the council rule that Diaspar must be closed again from the world. Now the world had broken in upon it with a vengeance, and not only the world, but the universe. The council itself had already changed. No less than 5 of its members were missing. They had been unable to face the responsibilities and problems now confronting them, and had followed the path that Kedron had already taken. It was, thought Jesserac, proof that Diaspar had failed if so many of its citizens were unable to face their first real challenge in millions of years. Many thousands of them had already fled into the brief oblivion of the memory banks, hoping that when they awoke, the crisis would be past and Diaspar would be its familiar self again. They would be disappointed. Jesserac had been co-opted to fill one of the vacant places on the council. Though he was still under something of a cloud owing to his position as Alvin's tutor, his presence was so obviously essential that no one had suggested excluding him. He sat at one end of the horseshoe-shaped table, a position which gave him several advantages. Not only could he study the profiles of the visitors, but he could also see the faces of his fellow counselors, and their expressions were sufficiently instructive. There was no doubt that Alvin had been right, and the council was slowly realizing the unpalatable truth. The delegates from Lys could think far more swiftly than the finest minds in Diaspar. Nor was that their only advantage, for they also showed an extraordinary degree of coordination, which Jesserac guessed must be due to their telepathic powers. He wondered if they were reading the counselors' thoughts, but decided that they would not have broken the solemn assurance without which this meeting would have been impossible. Jesserac did not think that much progress had been made. For that matter, he did not see how it could be. The council, which had barely accepted the existence of Lys, still seemed incapable of realizing what had happened. But it was clearly frightened, and so, he guessed, were the visitors, though they managed to conceal the fact better. Jesserac himself was not as terrified as he had expected. His fears were still there, but he had faced them at last. Something of Alvin's own recklessness, or was it courage, had begun to change his outlook and give him new horizons. He did not believe he would ever be able to set foot beyond the walls of Diaspar, but now he understood the impulse that had driven Alvin to do so. The president's question caught him unawares, but he recovered himself quickly. "I think," he said, "that it was sheer chance that this situation never arose before. We know that there were 14 earlier uniques, and there must have been some definite plan behind their creation. That plan, I believe, was to ensure that Lys and Diaspar would not remain apart forever. Alvin has seen to that, but he has also done something which I do not imagine was ever in the original scheme. Could the central computer confirm that?" The impersonal voice replied at once, "The counselor knows I cannot comment on the instructions given to me by my designers." Jesserac accepted the mild reproof. "Whatever the cause, we cannot dispute the facts. Alvin has gone out into space. When he returns, you may prevent him leaving again, though I doubt you will succeed, for he may have learnt a great deal by then. And if what you fear has happened, there is nothing any of us can do about it. Earth is utterly helpless, as she has been for millions of centuries." Jesserac paused and glanced across the tables. His words had pleased no one, nor had he expected them to do so. "Yet I don't see why we should be alarmed. Earth is in no greater danger now than she has always been. Why should 2 men in a single small ship bring the wrath of the invaders down upon us? If we'll be honest with ourselves, we must admit the invaders could have destroyed our world ages ago." There was a disapproving silence. This was heresy, and once Gesseric himself would have condemned it as such. The president interrupted, frowning heavily. Is there not a legend that the invaders spared Earth itself only on condition man never went into space again? And have we not now broken this condition? A legend, yes, said Gesseric. We accept many things without question, and this is one of them. However, there is no proof of it. I find it hard to believe that anything of such importance would not be recorded in the memories of the central computer, yet it knows nothing of this fact. I have asked it, though, only through the information machines. The Council may care to ask the question directly? Gesseric saw no reason why he should risk a second admonishment by trespassing on forbidden territory, and waited for the president's reply. It never came, for in that moment the visitors from Lys suddenly started in their seats, while their faces froze in simultaneous expressions of incredulity and alarm. They seemed to be listening while some faraway voice poured its message into their ears. The counselors waited, their own apprehension growing minute by minute as the soundless conversation proceeded. Then the leader of the delegation shook himself free from his trance and turned apologetically to the president. "We have just learned some very strange and disturbing news from Lys," he said. "Has Alvin returned to Earth?" asked the president. "No, not Alvin. Something else." As he brought his faithful ship down in the glade of Airlie, Alvin wondered if ever in human history any ship had brought such a cargo to Earth, if, indeed, Vanamond was located in the physical space of the ship. There had been no sign of him on the voyage. Hilvar believed, and his knowledge was more direct, that only Vanamond's sphere of attention could be said to have any position in space. Vanamond himself was not located anywhere. Perhaps not even any when. Seranus and 5 senators were waiting for them as they emerged from the ship. One of the senators Alvin had already met on his last visit. The other 2 from that previous meeting were, he gathered, now in Diaspar. He wondered how the delegation was faring, and how the city had reacted to the presence of the first intruders from outside in so many millions of years. "It seems, Alvin," said Seranus dryly after she had greeted her son, "that you have a genius for discovering remarkable entities. Still, I think it will be some time before you can surpass your present achievement." For once it was Alvin's turn to be surprised. "Then Vanamond's arrived?" "Yes, hours ago. Somehow he managed to trace the path your ship made on its journey outward, a staggering feat in itself, and one which raises interesting philosophical problems. There is some evidence that he reached Lys at the moment you discovered him, so that he is capable of infinite speeds. And that is not all. In the last few hours, he has taught us more of history than we thought existed." Alvin looked at her in amazement. Then he understood. It was not hard to imagine what the impact of Vanamond must have been upon this people, with their keen perception and their wonderfully interlocking minds. They had reacted with surprising speed, and he had a sudden, incongruous picture of Vanamond, perhaps a little frightened, surrounded by the eager intellects of Lys. "Have you discovered what he is?" Alvin asked. "Yes. That was simple, though we still don't know his origin. He is a pure mentality, and his knowledge seems to be unlimited. But he's childish, and I mean that quite literally." "Of course," cried Hilvar. "I should have guessed." Alvin looked puzzled, and Seranus took pity on him. "I mean that although Vanamond has a colossal, perhaps an infinite mind, he's immature and undeveloped. His actual intelligence is less than that of a human being." She smiled a little wryly. "Though his thought processes are much faster, and he learns very quickly. He also has some powers we do not yet understand. The whole of the past seems open to his mind in a way that's difficult to describe. He may have used that ability to follow your path back to Earth." Alvin stood in silence, for once somewhat overcome. He realized how right Hilvar had been to bring Vanamon to Lys, and he knew how lucky he had been ever to outwit Soranus. That was not something he would do twice in a lifetime. "Do you mean," he asked, "that Vanamon has only just been born?" "By his standards, yes. His actual age is very great, though apparently less than man's. The extraordinary thing is that he insists that we created him, and there's no doubt that his origin is bound up with all the great mysteries of the past." "What's happening to Vanamon now?" asked Hilvar in a slightly possessive voice. "The historians of Gravarn are questioning him. They are trying to map out the main outlines of the past, but the work will take years. Vanamon can describe the past in perfect detail, but he doesn't understand what he sees. It's very difficult to work with him." Alvin wondered how Soranus knew all this. Then he realized that probably every waking mind in Lys was watching the progress of the great research. He felt a sense of pride in the knowledge that he now had made as great a mark on Lys as on Diaspar. Yet with that pride was mingled frustration. Here was something which he could never fully share nor understand. The direct contact, even between human minds, was as great a mystery to him as music must be to a deaf man or color to a blind one. Yet the people of Lys were now exchanging thoughts with this unimaginably alien being, whom he had led to Earth, but whom he could never detect with any sense that he possessed. There was no place for him here. When the inquiry was finished, he would be told the answers. He had opened the gates of infinity, and now felt awe, even fear, for all that he had done. For his own peace of mind, he must return to the tiny, familiar world of Diaspar, seeking its shelter while he came to grips with his dreams and his ambitions. There was irony here. The one who had spurned the city to venture out among the stars was coming home as a frightened child runs back to its mother. Chapter 23. Diaspar was none too pleased to see Alvin again. The city was still in a ferment, like a giant beehive that had been violently stirred with a stick. It was still reluctant to face reality, but those who refused to admit the existence of Lys in the outside world no longer had a place to hide. The memory banks had ceased to accept them. Those who tried to cling to their dreams and to seek refuge in the future now walked in vain into the hall of creation. The dissolving, heatless flame refused to greet them. They no longer awoke, their minds washed clean 100,000 years further down the river of time. No appeal to the central computer was of any avail, nor would it explain the reason for its actions. The intended refugees had to turn sadly back into the city to face the problems of their age. Alvin had landed at the periphery of the park, not far from Council Hall. Until the last moment, he was not certain that he could bring the ship into the city, though whatever screens fenced its sky from the outer world. The firmament of Diaspar, like all else about it, was artificial, or at least partly so. Night, with its starry reminder of all that man had lost, was never allowed to intrude upon the city. It was protected also from the storms that sometimes raged across the desert and filled the sky with moving walls of sand. The invisible guardians let Alvin pass, and as Diaspar lay spread out beneath him, he knew that he had come home. However much the universe and its mysteries might call him, this was where he was born and where he belonged. It would never satisfy him, yet always he would return. He had gone halfway across the galaxy to learn this simple truth. The crowds had gathered even before the ship landed, and Alvin wondered how his fellow citizens would receive him now that he had returned. He could read their faces easily enough as he watched them through the viewing screen before he opened the airlock. The dominant emotion seemed to be curiosity, in itself something new in Diaspar. Mingled with that was apprehension. while here and there was unmistakable fear. No one, Alvin thought a little wistfully, seemed glad to see him back. The council, on the other hand, positively welcomed him, though not out of pure friendship. Though he had caused this crisis, he alone could give facts on which future policy must be based. He was listened to with deep attention as he described his flight to the Seven Suns and his meeting with Vanamond. Then he answered innumerable questions with a patience which probably surprised his interrogators. Uppermost in their minds, he quickly discovered, was the fear of the invaders, though they never mentioned the name, and were clearly unhappy when he broached the subject directly. "If the invaders are still in this universe," Alvin told the council, "then surely I should have met them at its very center. But there is no intelligent life among the Seven Suns. We had already guessed that before Vanamond confirmed it. I believe that the invaders departed ages ago. Certainly Vanamond, who appears to be at least as old as Diaspar, knows nothing of them." "I have a suggestion," said one of the counselors suddenly. "Vanamond may be a descendant of the invaders in some way beyond our present understanding. He has forgotten his origin, but that does not mean that one day he may not be dangerous again." Hilvar, who was present merely as a spectator, did not wait for permission to speak. It was the first time that Alvin had ever seen him angry. "Vanamond has looked into my mind," he said, "and I have glimpsed something of his. My people have already learned much about him, though they have not yet discovered what he is. But one thing is certain, he is friendly, and was glad to find us. We have nothing to fear from him." There was a brief silence after this outburst, and Hilvar relaxed with a somewhat embarrassed expression. It was noticeable that the tension in the council chamber lessened from then on, as if a cloud had lifted from the spirits of those present. Certainly the president made no attempt, as he was supposed to censure Hilvar for his interruption. It was clear to Alvin, as he listened to the debate, that three schools of thought were represented on the council. The conservatives, who were in a minority, still hoped that the clock could be turned back and the old order could somehow be restored. Against all reason, they clung to the hope that Diaspar and Lys could be persuaded to forget each other again. The progressives were an equally small minority. The fact that there were any on the council at all pleased and surprised Alvin. They did not exactly welcome this invasion of the outer world, but they were determined to make the best of it. Some of them went so far as to suggest that there might be a way of breaking through the psychological barriers which for so long had sealed Diaspar even more effectively than the physical ones. Most of the council, accurately reflecting the mood of the city, had adopted an attitude of watchful caution, while they waited for the pattern of the future to emerge. They realized that they could make no general plans nor try to carry out any definite policy until the storm had passed. Jesserac joined Alvin and Hilvar when the session was over. He seemed to have changed since they last met and last parted, in the Tower of Lorraine, with the desert spread out beneath them. The change was not one that Alvin had expected, though it was one that he was to encounter more and more often in days to come. Jesserac seemed younger, as if the fires of life had found fresh fuel and were burning more brightly in his veins. Despite his age, he was one of those who would accept the challenge that Alvin had thrown to Diaspar. "I have some news for you, Alvin," he said. "I think you know Senator Gerain." Alvin was puzzled for a moment, then he remembered. "Of course. Wasn't he one of the first men I met in Lys? Isn't he a member of their delegation?" "Yes, we have grown to know each other quite well. He is a brilliant man and understands more about the human mind than I would have believed possible, though he tells me that by the standards of Lys he is only a beginner. While he is here, he is starting a project which will be very close to your heart. He is hoping to analyze the compulsion which keeps us in the city, and he believes that once he has discovered how it was imposed, he will be able to remove it. About 20 of us are already cooperating with him." "And you are one of them?" "Yes," replied Jesserac, showing the nearest approach to bashfulness that Alvin had ever seen or would ever see. "It's not easy, and certainly not pleasant, but it is stimulating." "How does Gerain work?" "He is operating through the sagas. He has had a whole series of them constructed and studies our reactions while we are experiencing them. I never thought at my age that I should go back to my childhood recreations again." "What are sagas?" asked Hilvar. "Imaginary dream worlds," explained Alvin. "At least most of them are imaginary, though some are probably based on historical facts. There are millions of them recorded in the memory cells of the city. You can take your choice of any kind of adventure or experience you wish, and it will seem utterly real to you while the impulses are being fed into your mind." He turned to Jesserac. "What kind of sagas does Geraint take you into?" "Most of them are concerned, as you might expect, with leaving Diaspar. Some have taken us back to our very earliest lives, to as near to the founding of the city as we can get. Geraint believes that the closer he can get to the origin of this compulsion, the more easily he will be able to undermine it." Alvin felt very encouraged by this news. His work would be merely half accomplished if he opened the gates of Diaspar only to find that no one would pass through them. "Do you really want to be able to leave Diaspar?" asked Hilvar shrewdly. "No," replied Jesserac without hesitation. "I am terrified at the idea, but I realize that we were completely wrong in thinking that Diaspar was all the world that mattered, and logic tells me that something has to be done to rectify the mistake. Emotionally, I am still quite incapable of leaving the city. Perhaps I always shall be. Geraint thinks he can get some of us to go to Lys, and I'm willing to help with the experiment, even though half the time I hope it will fail." Alvin looked at his old tutor with a new respect. He no longer discounted the power of suggestion, nor underestimated the forces which could compel a man to act in defiance of logic. He could not help comparing Jesserac's calm courage with Kedron's panic flight into the future, though with his new understanding of human nature he no longer cared to condemn the jester for what he had done. Geraint, he was certain, would accomplish what he set out to do. Jesserac might be too old to break the pattern of a lifetime, however willing he might be to start afresh. That did not matter, for others would succeed with the skilled guidance of the psychologists of Lys, and once a few had escaped from their billion-year-old mold, it would only be a question of time before the remainder would follow. He wondered what would happen to Diaspar and to Lys when the barriers were fully down. Somehow, the best elements of both must be saved and welded into a new and healthier culture. It was a terrifying task and would need all the wisdom and all the patience that each could bring to bear. Some of the difficulties of the forthcoming adjustments had already been encountered. The visitors from Lys had, politely enough, refused to live in the homes provided for them in the city. They had set up their own temporary accommodation in the park, among surroundings which reminded them of Lys. Hilvar was the only exception. Though he disliked living in a house with indeterminate walls and ephemeral furniture, he bravely accepted Alvin's hospitality, reassured by the promise that they would not stay here for long. Hilvar had never felt lonely in his life, but he knew loneliness in Diaspar. The city was more strange to him than Lys had been to Alvin, and he was oppressed and overwhelmed by its infinite complexity and by the myriads of strangers who seemed to crowd every inch of space around him. He knew, if only in a tenuous manner, everyone in Lys, whether he had met them or not. In 1,000 lifetimes he could never know everyone in Diaspar, and though he realized that this was an irrational feeling, it left him feeling vaguely depressed. Only his loyalty to Alvin held him here in a world which had nothing in common with his own. He had often tried to analyze his feelings toward Alvin. His friendship sprang, he knew, from the same source that inspired his sympathy for all small and struggling creatures. This would have astonished those who thought of Alvin as willful, stubborn, and self-centered, needing no affection from anyone and incapable of returning it even if it was offered. Hilvar knew better than this. He had sensed it instinctively from the first. Alvin was an explorer, and all explorers are seeking something they have lost. It is seldom that they find it, and more seldom still that the attainment brings them greater happiness than the quest. What Alvin was seeking, Hilvar did not know. He was driven by forces that had been set in motion ages before by the men of genius who planned Diaspar with such perverse skill, or by the men of greater genius who had opposed them. Like every human being, Alvin was in some measure a machine, his actions predetermined by his inheritance. That need not alter his need for understanding and sympathy, nor did it render him immune to loneliness or frustration. To his own people, he was so unaccountable a creature that they sometimes forgot he still shared their emotions. It needed a stranger from a totally different environment to see him as another human being. Within a few days of arriving in Diaspar, Hilvar had met more people than ever before in his entire life. Met them, and had grown to know practically none. Because they were so crowded together, the inhabitants of the city maintained a reserve that was hard to penetrate. The only privacy they knew was that of the mind, and they still clung to this even as they made their way through the endless social activities of Diaspar. Hilvar felt sorry for them, though he knew that they felt no need for his sympathy. They did not realize what they were missing. They could not understand the warm sense of community, the feeling of belonging which had linked everyone together in the telepathic society of Lys. Indeed, though they were polite enough to try to conceal it, it was obvious that most of the people he spoke to looked upon him pityingly as leading an incredibly dull and drab existence. Ariston and Etania, Alvin's guardians, Hilvar quickly dismissed as kindly but totally baffled nonentities. He found it very confusing to hear Alvin refer to them as his father and mother, words which in Lys still retained their ancient biological meaning. It required a continual effort of imagination to remember that the laws of life and death had been repealed by the makers of Diaspar, and there were times when it seemed to Hilvar that despite all the activity around him, the city was half empty because it had no children. He wondered what would happen to Diaspar now that its long isolation was over. The best thing the city could do, he decided, was to destroy the memory banks which held it entranced for so many ages. Miraculous though they were, perhaps the supreme triumph of the science that had produced them, they were the creations of a sick culture, a culture that had been afraid of many things. Some of those fears had been based on reality, but others, it now seemed, lay only in the imagination. Hilvar knew a little of the pattern that was beginning to emerge from the explorations of Vanamon's mind. In a few days, Diaspar would know too, and would discover how much of its past had been a myth. Yet, if the memory banks were destroyed, within 1,000 years the city would be dead, since its people had lost the power to reproduce themselves. That was the dilemma that had to be faced, but already Hilvar had glimpsed one possible solution. There was always an answer to any technical problem, and his people were masters of the biological sciences. What had been done could be undone, if Diaspar so wished. First, however, the city would have to learn what it had lost. Its education would take many years, perhaps many centuries, but it was beginning. Very soon, the impact of the first lesson would shake Diaspar as profoundly as had contact with Lys itself. It would shake Lys, too. For all the difference between the two cultures, they had sprung from the same roots. They shared the same illusions. They would both be healthier when they looked once more with calm and steadfast gaze into the past that they had lost. And we will look into that past next time.